I just want to start my comments by thanking every single person involved in making this event happen, but I need to give a special thank you to this young sister, Crystal Okafor, who got me all the way together, okay? Not part of the way together, she got me all the way together. And January has been the busiest month of my career, so that was no easy task. When they first invited me, I was so excited to come in person and give this talk. But of course, the situation as it is, I'm not able to make it with you in person. But this Zoom, we're gonna make this do what it do. We're gonna make it work, all right? So let's start up these slides. All right. As Margot mentioned, all of my work has to do with land stolen from people of the African diaspora. My first book, We Want What's Ours, Learning from South Africa's Land Restitution Program, really looks at land stolen during colonialism and apartheid and evaluates the post-apartheid government's program, their land restitution program to give this land back. And from that work came two very important socio-legal concepts that will be the core of my talk today. The first is this idea of a dignity takings. And the argument in the book is to say that in certain instances, if I take something from you, the point is at the moment of compensation, it's to give you that thing back or something that's equivalent to that thing. But there are other instances where I take something from you as part of a larger strategy of dehumanization or infantilization. In those instances, I've robbed you of more than just your property, but I also robbed you of your dignity. And so I call that larger harm a dignity taking. The argument in the book goes, when this larger harm called a dignity taking has occurred, mere reparations are not enough, right? Just providing compensation for a thing taken is not enough. What's required is a more robust remedy that I call dignity restoration. And that is when you give dispossessed individuals and communities compensation for a thing taken through a process that affirms their humanity and restores their agency. So of course, South Africa was the perfect place for these concepts to arise, because when South Africa transitions from apartheid to democracy in 1994, 87% of the land was owned by whites, although they constituted less than 10% of the population. And this was a clear, unequivocal, the historical record is clear, unequivocal result of the dehumanization and infantilization of the native people. So it's just one of the clearest examples of a dignity taking. And in my interview, I interviewed a gentleman who I gave the pseudonym Mr. Richardson from a place called Kliptown. And Kliptown basically was an integrated area. And during apartheid, they had a piece of legislation called the Group Areas Act. And it basically sent everyone to their place. So whites went with whites, Zulus went with Zulus, Sutu went with Sutu, etc. And what they would do is come in, and Kliptown was actually assigned to be a white area, and Mr. Richardson was colored. And he talks about the day that they came to bulldoze the house, because that was one of the strategies of the South African government. After they removed you, they would bulldoze the house so you didn't come back. And he talks about the day when they bulldozed this house that was given to him by his father and was given to his father by his father, right? He talks about the day he saw that house bulldozed. He was on his way to be a teacher, which at the time was the highest profession that colored people could achieve. And he talks about it in terms of it wasn't just, the home that was bulldozed. He talks about it in terms of it being his dreams. He says your dreams, your aspirations, and your hope is destroyed. It was bulldozed. So sometimes it's more than just mere bricks and mortar that we have at stake. And that is the core concept behind a dignity takings, which Mr. Richardson so crisply captures in his quote there. South Africa was also the perfect place for this idea of dignity restoration to arise. Now, my work deals with land restitution programs, not only in South Africa, but I've looked at them in the US, Czech Republic, Australia, Kosovo, Romania, Baltic Republic, El Salvador, Hungary, Germany, Guatemala, Slovakia, Canada, and now I'm actually working with the government of Colombia. But what makes the South African restitution program, different than all of these other restitution programs that I've studied, is they actually try to achieve this larger remedy called dignity restoration. This is a quote from the first Minister of Agriculture and Land Affairs in South Africa, who says, "The struggle for dignity, equality, and a sense of belonging has been the driving force behind our work as a land claims commission." And so in my book, I look at the ways in which they succeeded and failed at this larger task of dignity restoration. Before I go further, I want to explain to you land reform in South Africa. It's really all found in Section 25 of the South African Constitution, and it's in 3 parts. The first part is land redistribution. And that's the process of giving people land, not based on their ownership rights in the past, but based on their current need and ability to use the land. The second prong of the South African land reform program is land tenure reform. And that is non-whites, blacks were not allowed to own land outside of the designated areas. And so they were tenants. And so this is a process of upgrading them from tenants to owners. The third and final prong is what I studied and what we'll be talking about today, which is a land restitution program found in Section 25.7 of the South African Constitution, which says that any right and land dispossessed after 1913 you have an opportunity for equitable redress, for an equitable remedy. You might be asking yourself, why 1913? Well, because South Africa becomes a nation in 1910, and 1913 is the year that this newly founded nation passed its first act to dispossess Blacks called the Native Land Act, the Natives Land Act. All right. And so that's the constitutional provision. And so what I did in my first book is I did semi-structured interviews with over 100 people dispossessed from urban areas. I intentionally focused on urban areas because most of the literature focused on rural areas. On top of that, so that was kind of bottom up. I also did top down, doing semi-structured interviews of commission officials. But most importantly, I use ethnographic methods. I use participant observation, where I actually had an office and was inside of the Land Claims Commission itself for 9 months, integrated into their daily operations, observing what was going on from the inside out. And then, of course, secondary sources. Now, through these, again, ethnographic methods, I was able to come out from this case and I identified a phenomenon. Okay, a phenomenon that I call dignity takings and dignity restoration. Now, I want to make it very clear that my methods don't allow me to generalize. Quant people, they generalize. My methods don't allow me to generalize. So what I do, this project took me 7 years to complete. So I took a deep, deep dive into this, and I came out and I identified a phenomenon. And really, it's up to other scholars to take my concepts and see whether or not that they apply in other instances, right? I can't tell you that. Other scholars have to tell you that. And that's exactly what has happened. At this point, over 30 different scholars have taken the concepts of dignity takings and dignity restoration and applied them in various situations. I'll give you some examples. Alfred Brophy looked at what the concepts and how they fit into the Tulsa race riots. I'm speaking to NYU, so your own Professor Daniel Hasselbosch wrote a brilliant piece about how these concepts fit into the property taken from loyalists during the American Revolution. It's a really beautifully written piece that you should look up. Another scholar, Carol Rose from Yale Law School, looked at how these concepts apply to the area of racially restrictive covenants. Dirk Hartog from Princeton took the concepts to see how they apply to coverture, right? The fact that women in a certain period in early America could not own property, and really interrogating how these concepts work in that particular area. My former colleague, Cesar Rosado, looks at these concepts in the area of wage theft, right? I can go on and on. But there were 2 particular contributions that I want to point out. But I really want to say that before I get to the 2, so I need you to understand that these concepts have been looked at by lawyers, historians, sociologists, anthropologists, political scientists, education specialists, ethnomusicologists, right? So they've been taken and used by a variety of disciplines in a variety of applications. including they've been applied to indigenous people, violent conflict, criminal punishment, contract law, labor and employment, public policy, intangible property, community property, property taxes, right? The list goes on and on. And, but this is a conversation. So what happened is my initial definition of dignity takings was, as you can see here on the screen, which is when a state directly or indirectly destroys or confiscates property rights from owners or occupiers who it deems to be subperson, this is the key, without paying just compensation or without a legitimate public purpose. So in my initial definition of a dignity taking, I hewed very closely to constitutional takings. But there was a contribution by one scholar, Eva Pills from King's College London, that changed my mind. She changed my mind. Her case study, her work, she's an ethnographer, and she looks, her specialty is China, and she looks at the way in which Chinese urban areas, Chinese cities are expanding, and the consequences for rural people and their land being taken from them as a result of the expansion of cities. And what she found is that even though the Chinese government provided compensation to these rural people, that they had no opportunity to protest the amount given through a court system. There was often violence involved, infantilization involved. And so she brings to the fore the fact that just because there's compensation provided, that is really of no consequence. And I think she's right about that. And so as the definitions evolved, the definition of dignity taking evolved. And now the updated definition doesn't include that piece about whether just compensation was paid. It really focuses on whether or not intentional or unintentional outcome was dehumanization or infantilization. And just as the concept of dignity takings has evolved, as all of these various scholars have engaged the terms, so has the definition of dignity restoration evolved. The original definition based on the South African case in my original book in We Want What's Ours was compensation that addresses both the economic harms and dignity deprivations involved. And its purpose is to rehabilitate dispossessed populations and, get this, reintegrate them into the fabric of society through an emphasis on process. That's clearly applicable to the South African case. But a scholar, an anthropologist, a legal anthropologist named Justin Richland. His work is so amazing. He's an anthropologist who's actually was invited by the Hopi people to sit on their Supreme Court. These anthropologists are great. All right, he's a Jewish brother who was invited by the Hopi people to sit on their Supreme Court. And he wrote a piece about a piece of land taken from the Hopi people. And in fact, this piece of land was sacred. And what the US Forest Service did is they took this sacred land and put a ski slope on top of the sacred land. Not only did they put a ski slope on top of the sacred land, but in order to make the snow, they showered the land in recycled wastewater. So as Professor Richland points out, they were literally shitting on the Hopi people's sacred site. And so what Justin Richland makes a point is he says, listen, the Hopi people don't want anything to do with reintegration into any society. What they want is separation. What they want is independence. What they want is autonomy. And that too is dignity restoration. And I said, Professor Richland, you're right. And so the definition of dignity restoration has evolved to take out that language that applied to South Africa, but doesn't apply in other places like the instance of the Hopi people. So I took out that language of being reintegrated into society and just said that it has to really have a process that affirms their humanity and embraces their agency. And so you can see these two terms have evolved as scholars have interacted with them. And so that first project took me quite a while, and it was time well spent because, again, I was able to identify a phenomenon that other scholars show has resonance in so many different geographic areas over so many different time periods to so many different subject matters. So that first project was a success, and but I was a little uncomfortable because I told you all my work deals with land stolen from people of the African diaspora. But I was really uncomfortable with the first project because it looked at Black people as the victims, the ones being stolen from. So I said, no. My next project, I want to look at Black people doing the stealing, okay? And so I was like, you know what? This is squatting. And we all know squatting is when people take land that they don't have a legal right, that does not belong to them. So I wanted to study using my ethnographic methods, the phenomenon of squatting. And again, you all are at NYU, so you would know the largest, most recent squatting phenomenon in US history happened on the Lower East Side of New York. But what is currently happening in terms of squatting in the city of Detroit far outpaces anything that was going on in the Lower East Side. So I came to Detroit initially to study squatting. I actually won an NSF grant and came to Detroit and started doing my research. And there's two kinds of squatters. One that I call takeovers, which is how the common, general people think about squatting. It's people who come into a piece of property who have no prior legal relationship to that property. But property scholars know that there's a second category called holdovers. And that's people who once had a legal relationship to that property, but they fell out of it. So in my case, they were people who owned the home, but got subject to tax foreclosure, and they stayed. So they were once owners, but now they were squatters. And so when I started interviewing both of those groups of people, I started realizing like, oh my goodness, this tax foreclosure is a thing. And so I switched my project. I'm going to get back to the squatting project because that was also fascinating. But I had to switch my project to focus on the tax foreclosure crisis because people, my neighbors, because I do ethnography, so I'm actually coming to you from the east side of Detroit. I intentionally live in a community hard hit by the property tax foreclosure crisis. I live in the 48214 zip code. And I can tell you that since 2009, 1 in 3 homes in Detroit, not properties, homes, has completed the property tax foreclosure crisis. Completed the property tax foreclosure process. We haven't seen this number of property tax foreclosures in American history since the Great Depression. We're talking about over 100,000 families, homes have been taken from them by the government, right? So we all know mortgage foreclosures when you don't pay your mortgage and the bank takes your home. Tax foreclosures when you don't pay your property taxes and the bank takes your home. That's what's happening in Detroit currently. And I want to give you a sense of the scale of this problem. So here's a chart provided by Loveland to show you the number of properties that have completed the foreclosure process between 2002 and 2017. Now look at this. Every red dot here is a home that has completed the property tax foreclosure process. This is what it looks like at the neighborhood level. And this is what it looks like at the city level. As you can see, there is not one neighborhood unaffected by this property tax foreclosure crisis. I want to repeat, since 2009, 1 in 3 homes has completed the tax foreclosure crisis. So the question is, what in the world is going on in Detroit, right? What in the world is going on in Detroit? Well, part of the answer to this query is about these misbehaving banks and the predatory lending. So we know that during the Great Recession, property prices declined throughout the nation. But in Black and brown communities, they take a precipitous dive because that's where the predatory lending was most intense. As you can see, that's exactly what happens in Detroit. Property prices take a precipitous dive and they never recover. This is the very same time that Detroit is going through the largest municipal bankruptcy in US history. And so they just didn't have the staff they needed to adjust property values to reflect these new low property values, right? So a lot of people like to kind of just blame Detroit and the fact that they didn't have enough people to do this adjustment, but we need to look a couple of steps up, right? We need to look at these neoliberal policies of retrenchment that made Detroit, to the fact that they didn't have enough employees to do this. And we need to look another step up to these corporations, to these banks. You know, no one has gone to jail yet for this predatory, well-documented predatory lending. All right. So let me make sure you can follow my presentation. I want to make sure each and every person understands how the property tax bill in Michigan is calculated. Okay, it's your taxable value or assessed value minus exemptions. And in Michigan, the exemptions are mostly for poverty, seniors, and veterans, times the property tax rate. Now, before I started my work, there was actually quite a bit of work done on the property tax rate in Detroit, which is one of the highest in Michigan. There was also quite a bit of work done on the taxable value or assessed value on assessment inequity, done mostly by economists at Michigan State and urban planners at the University of Michigan. But before I started doing my work, nobody really was looking at the illegality of it all. Because it's one thing to say something's unjust, and it's a whole other thing to say it's just straight up illegal. So the Michigan State Constitution is quite clear. No property can be assessed at more than 50% of its market value. This is well backed up by case law and legislation. There's really no question. No property can be assessed at more than 50% of its market value. Other state laws, to the extent they mention assessed value, it says things like they may be uniform, fair, equal, which are all nebulous standards for a court to determine illegality. Because Michigan has a ratio, it means people like me can come in and run the numbers to determine legality, and that's precisely what we did. Our findings were shocking. What we found is that between 2009 and 2015, in each of those 7 years, anywhere between 55 and 85% of properties were being assessed in violation of the Michigan State Constitution. Let me pause for that to sink in. Up to 85% of properties in the city were being assessed in violation of the Michigan State Constitution. And when we broke that data up into what we call 5 quintiles, quintile 1 being the lowest valued homes and quintile 5 being the highest valued homes, we found that in quintile 1 and 2, 95% or more of the homes were being assessed in violation of the Michigan State Constitution. But when you got to quintile 5, it was less than 20%. So we find that the burden of these illegally inflated property taxes falls disproportionately on the homeowners with the lowest valued homes, the most vulnerable homeowners. All right, what many of you know is that Detroit goes through the largest municipal bankruptcy in US history and gets taken over by an emergency manager appointed by Governor Snyder, by Michigan's governor. But what many of you don't know is because of this rampant illegality that I've just described to you, Detroit's assessment division also gets taken over by the state of Michigan, and they only get back control at the end of 2017, because at the top of 2017, they finally complete a parcel by parcel reassessment of every single property in the city. And so we redid again how we did. And so I didn't do this assessment ratio study. An assessment ratio study is what I just showed you. It's the way you figure out if a jurisdiction is doing assessments equitably. I didn't do this second one. The University of Chicago Center for Municipal Finance did this second assessment ratio study after that 2017 fix. And what they found, the good news, I always like to start with the good news. Okay, so the good news is on average, things did get better. The bad news is, as you can see here, for the lowest valued homes, things didn't get better. Look at these red lines. Even after 2017, we have the vast majority of the lowest valued homes still being assessed in violation of the Michigan State Constitution. So till this day, we have these, the property tax assessments of the lowest valued homes are still being illegally inflated. And this is what we call, so property taxes are what we call regressive. And all that means is that the lower valued homes are taxed at a higher rate than the higher valued homes. I'll say that once again. It means the lower valued homes are taxed at a higher rate than the higher valued homes. And as you can see by this chart, that's exactly what's happening in Detroit. On the left, the higher valued homes are taxed far below the Michigan constitutional level, but the lower valued homes are taxed above the Michigan State constitutional, the constitutional limit, right? And this is what we call, so property tax assessments are regressive. You'll hear me use that term. So I want to make sure you understand it. All right, so where does this all leave us? Let me tell you something. All right, so we scholars, me and some others who are deep into this, have been sounding the alarm bells, talking about the illegality, you know, talking about it all. But there was a expose done by the Detroit News. Let me tell you, these investigative journalists are brilliant. They made two power moves, right? The first was they put a number on it. So I was saying between 55 and 85% of properties were being assessed in violation of Michigan state constitution. They're like, no, no, no. They are able to tell us with the most conservative estimates possible that between 2010 and 2016, homeowners were overtaxed by $600 million, right? And there's something about, putting a number to it that just advanced the conversation. The second power move that these investigative reporters did, and I was like, I'm taking notes, okay? What they did is they created a website where any homeowner in Detroit can put in their address to find out how much they individually were being overtaxed. My God, my God. This lit the city on fire. When people, it's one thing to know about an injustice, and it's a whole other thing to know about how that injustice has affected you in dollars and cents. Honey, there was a protest at City Hall. Now, I'm pretty left-leaning. I've been to lots of protests in my day, but this protest was something else. People were yelling, cut the check, cut the check, cut the damn check. People were being dragged out by police. I mean, it was quite something. People were upset, rightfully so. It was as if somebody had stolen a senior's purse and the whole mob was after the culprit, and in the mind of the people, the culprit was the mayor. And so again, I'm taking notes because it's like one thing to do research and to expose an injustice, but it's another thing to figure out how to make that injustice intelligible to the average homeowner. So I have to say, I can't say enough about this Detroit News expose. All right, so now, in my next paper called Taxed Out, me and Christopher Berry, who's again a professor at the University of Chicago, we then wanted to know, okay, we now have a good estimate of how much was taken from the people, but we also wanted to figure out the exact impact of these illegally inflated property tax assessments on foreclosure rates. And as many of you listening know, there's lots of things that cause tax foreclosure. People are poor, a big medical bill, death, divorce, I can go on and on. There's so many variables. So the real challenge in this study was holding all those variables constant so we can measure the one variable of interest, these illegally inflated property tax assessments. We wanted to know their impact on foreclosure rates. And using the most conservative estimates possible, we are able to tell you that 10% of all tax foreclosures would not have happened but for these illegally inflated property tax assessments. And of those lowest valued homes, where I showed you that 95% or more were being assessed both before and after the 2017 fix, we're able to say that 1 in 4 of those homes would not have gone into foreclosure but for these illegally inflated property tax assessments. My God. All right, so where does that leave us? So first, we have a situation where the good people of Detroit are being subjected to these unconstitutional property tax assessments. And then when they cannot afford to pay the resulting illegally inflated property taxes, they are being foreclosed upon at rates we have not seen in American history since the Great Depression. Now, I haven't talked about step 4, and this is the most important step. All for property taxes they should not have been paying in the first place. What do I mean by that? I told you one of the exemptions is for poverty. If you live below the poverty line, you don't have to pay property taxes. And 40% of Detroiters live below the poverty line. But the point is, the city of Detroit made it so difficult to access this exemption that most Detroiters didn't know about it, number one, and those who did could not access it. And what do I mean? I mean, from little things, none of it's little, but from things like not putting the application online to more invidious things like requiring homeowners to come all the way down to City Hall, not call, not mail. They had to drive down, somehow take a bus down to City Hall, wait in line to go to the assessment office and fill out an application. And you know what happened once they filled out that application? That allowed the assessor to mail the actual application to their home. Yes, you heard me correctly. They literally had to apply in order to apply. These types of nonsensical barriers are what prevented Detroiters from accessing this exemption. And the city of Detroit only cleaned up its act when the legal dream team came in and sued them. NAACP Legal Defense Fund, ACLU of Michigan, and Deep Pockets of Covington and Burlington, DC, filed suit against the city of Detroit. It was a two-part lawsuit, but we're only concerned with the first part, which is against the city of Detroit for obstructive administration of the poverty tax exemption. As a result of that lawsuit, again, like Crystal got me all the way together, ACLU, they got the city all the way together, okay? And so now the property tax exemption is very accessible and homeowners have access to it. But that wasn't, from the benevolence of the city, it was as a settlement to this class action lawsuit by some of the best lawyers in our nation. All right, y'all. So I just told you that after my South Africa project, I was like, I don't want to look at Black people as victims, right? Then I tell you, I came to Detroit to study squatting. I wanted to look at Black people doing the stealing. And where am I? I'm back with dignity takings and dignity restoration. I can't, they're just stealing from Black people again. So of course, these concepts are now again more relevant than ever. So what's happening in Detroit is a clear dignity takings. I need you to understand that these illegally inflated property taxes are merely the latest chapter in a longer history of racialized dispossession that has happened throughout the years, not only in Detroit, but lots of other urban areas. Okay, it starts with racially restrictive, it starts with slavery, for Black people, but racially restrictive covenants, urban racial zoning, redlining, urban renewal, block busting, predatory mortgage lending, right? And so you need to understand these illegally inflated property taxes, again, as the tail end of a larger phenomenon, of a larger instance of intergenerational structural racism. So this is without a doubt a dignity takings, a quintessential example, in fact. And so where there's a dignity restoration, where there's a dignity takings, we need dignity restoration, right? Which is putting these dispossessed individuals and communities in the driver's seat and allowing them to determine how it is that they're made whole. And so that's exactly what we are trying to do. We created the Coalition for Property Tax Justice, which is a coalition here in Detroit of about a dozen grassroots organizations who are teaming with researchers like myself, law students, lawyers, right? And so the coalition has three primary goals. The first is to stop these illegally inflated property taxes, which I've just made clear have gotten better, but they're still continuing today. Our second goal is to stop these ongoing foreclosures, because you wouldn't believe me when I tell you that they're still foreclosing on people, although there's this unequivocal evidence of the illegally inflated property taxes. And so what we're saying is, do not stop the foreclosure on owner-occupied homes until we can ensure that the people being foreclosed upon are actually, they haven't been charged any illegally inflated property taxes. Because when you take someone's home for tax foreclosure, that is an act of legal violence. Okay, it's an act of legal violence that should only be exercised with extreme legal caution. And in Detroit, in place of caution, we have recklessness, extreme recklessness. And so what we're saying as a coalition is, no, we need to, before you foreclose, before you exercise this legal violence called tax foreclosure, we need to ensure that nobody was overassessed, okay? And the coalition's third and final goal is compensation. More specifically, we have identified we don't just say compensation, we're not saying reparations, we are looking for dignity restoration. So here comes the concept, yet again, right here. And what does that look like in Detroit? Well, just this past Saturday, we actually had something, the coalition teamed up with Council President Mary Sheffield, and we had something called the People's Forum. It was a wildly successful event, I am so glad to say, with over 700 Detroiters in attendance on an online virtual event. And what we did is we said, look, this is a compensation of a menu of options, right? And we said, look, did we get the menu right? Is there something that should be there, shouldn't be there? The first part of the event was presentations by, again, Council President, Congresswoman Rashida Tlaib, an affected homeowner named Sonia Bonnet, and myself doing the education. That was the first part of the event. But the second part of the event was the most important part, which is we broke up into 7 different small groups, which gave people with trained facilitators and scribes. And we put this menu of options before people. Did we get it right? What needs to be changed? What needs to be added? Right? Because what did I just say about dignity restoration? It's about putting dispossessed individuals and communities in the driver's seat and allowing them to determine how it is they're made whole. Me, Professor Atuahene, I have no business telling anybody, oh, you had a house stolen, you deserve a house. No, maybe they don't want to, they're over home ownership. Maybe they want a Section 8 voucher. Maybe they want something else. But that is the key of dignity restoration. It's about restoring assets through a process that also restores agency. And so that's what we are now trying to put these theoretical ideas into practice right here in Detroit. And we are hoping to pass this ordinance before the end of the year. So all of y'all who are praying, people, pray for us, honey.